Do you guys remember the Scholastic Book Fair when you were growing up? It was one of the few times of year that I got excited to get pulled out of class, aside from like random assemblies. I remember getting that multi-page flyer thing and seeing all the cool things that were on sale and begging my mom to let me have some money to get something. There were only ever two things that I was drawn to at the book fair. One was a wide array of Calvin and Hobbes compilation books, and the other was scary stories to tell in the dark. But before we dive in, if you're looking for a chill community to be a part of, come on over to the Somewhere Past Never Discord server. Everyone's friendly, the vibe is chill, you can get details about the channel's schedule, and there are plenty of wild Pokemon waiting to be caught. A big thank you to these lovely people for the continued support on Patreon. Your help means the world to me and I very much appreciate you. If you'd like to have your name added to the list and see videos early, consider following the link in the description below. Last but not least, I've started streaming on Twitch. You can find me over at twitch.tv/somewherepastnever. Head on over and give me a follow so that you can be there when I go live. I'd love to see you guys there, and it'd be fun to get up to some shenanigans with you guys. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content. Make sure you hit the notification bell so you never miss out on content when it goes up, and as always, thanks for watching. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark is a collection of 3 books penned by Alvin Schwartz and illustrated by Stephen Gamble. The trilogy contains numerous short stories within the horror genre that are essentially retellings or reimaginings of popular folklore or urban legends that were making the rounds at the time. As a middle schooler walking into the library for the book fair, I was immediately drawn to the artwork of the franchise. It evoked a kind of repulsion in me that few things were able to replicate at that time. And it was among the first pieces of media that I can remember that gave me that uncanny sensation that it was looking back at me. Stephen's art has an ethereal style to it that plants you deep in the uncanny valley at some points while rocketing you into sheer absurdity at others. It felt tangible, you know, like if you stared too hard at a particular piece, like it would come crawling off the page. I distinctly remember stacking books and magazines on top of my copy of the first book, or flipping it face down because I got this weird sense of dread from it. The stories gave me those same vibes when paired with the oddly visceral artwork.
Look at this! Look at this! They showed this to kids!
The stories themselves were stuffed with violent subject matter, disturbing imagery, and the uncomfortable reality of death itself. As a kid, I wasn't necessarily being exposed to these kind of macabre topics aside from the very occasional horror movie or attending an actual funeral. So reading these books felt like I was doing something rebellious, like I was reading something I wasn't supposed to, and that made it more exciting. I would even make sure to buy a Calvin and Hobbes book alongside Scary Stories just in case my mom asked what I had decided on, just so I wouldn't get in trouble. I absolutely loved these books as a kid, and they were my introduction to literary horror. I have such distinct memories of them, and I'd be lying if I said that some pieces of this franchise didn't live rent-free in my brain. And talking about the franchise recently with a family member, it got me thinking, are these stories actually any good? Do these stories that millions and millions of people love and look back fondly of hold up in the 40 years since their debut? Not really. I'll explain why in a few minutes, but first, why don't we start with a more positive approach? Let's go through each of the 3 books, and I will tell you about my 3 favorite stories from each. For transparency's sake, I will be skipping the stories that are just essentially glorified jump scare tutorials, as well as the ones that are intended to be funny, because even as a kid, these stories felt out of place. Starting with the first book, in 3rd place we've got The Thing, but not John Carpenter's. In this story, 2 friends are just kind of minding their business when a creepy figure appears across the road from them, slowly getting closer and closer. They kind of just laugh it off at first, but that humor turns to fear as this thing just keeps closing the gap. Eventually, one of the guys decides to get a good look at it, and the sight sends him into a horrified panic. The 2 of them flee, and eventually the one that decided not to get close falls ill and dies. The surviving friend, at the funeral, remarks that his late friend looked just like the thing he saw. I like this one because it's short and simple and it doesn't waste any time with unnecessary details. The lingering mystery of how that iteration of the victim was there in the first place in itself is pretty unnerving. In 2nd place is The Haunted House. In this story, a priest stays in a house looking to either disprove or remove a supposed haunting. At first, his night is quiet and he reads his Bible without much to snag his attention. But just after midnight, he starts to hear the sound of someone coming up the basement steps. Naturally, dude's not exactly thrilled by this, and after some back and forth over a couple of hours, a woman's spirit emerges from the basement. She asks him to uncover her bone, and her bone, singular. Her singular bone. She asks him to uncover her bones and give her a proper burial, but also requests that the priest expose the man that had killed her. To do so, she gives him the tip of her pinky finger and tells him to place it in the collection plate at the next church service. The finger will let him know who the culprit is. Following her instructions during the next service, it isn't long before a man is freaking out because the finger is sticking to his hand and won't come off. He confesses his crimes and brings the story and the priest's job to a close. I enjoy this one because it has a decent amount of personality. You think it's going to go one way with a simple haunting story, but then it turns into a low-key murder mystery. The artwork for this story honestly does a great deal of the heavy lifting in terms of setting the tone. I can't even lie about that, and honestly, it really creeped me out as a kid. It made my skin crawl. My favorite story in the first collection is Room for One More. This one is fairly simple. A man continuously sees a creepy figure in situations in which the figure beckons the man to join by saying there's room for one more. Of course, the man is very consistently weirded out by the vibes he's getting, so he refuses to accompany the figure. At the end of the story, the figure is in a full elevator and beckons the man to join, again saying there's room for one more. Still feeling uncomfortable, the man declines and the elevator doors close. Immediately, the elevator car goes plummeting down through the shaft, killing everyone inside. What I've always enjoyed about this story is the concept of death as an ever-present figure, coaxing us towards decisions that ultimately lead us toward it. I related to the man's reluctance to join despite there being room for him in each scenario. It's really that simple. Despite the ending being visible from miles away, it's the coaxing as denoted by the title that makes it unsettling, especially when you consider how friendly and disarming a phrase like room for one more typically is. Onward to book 2, and just like book 1, I'm going to be skipping all the stories that are intended to be funny or make the reader laugh. This is going to be true for book 3 as well, so I'm just going to say that now and save myself the time later. In third place we have the story Something Was Wrong. This story follows a man who's wandering around downtown, unsure of how he got there or what he'd been doing prior. He asks a woman what time it is, but instead of telling him, she screams and runs away. Then the man noticed others appeared to be afraid of him too. He hailed a taxi, but when the driver saw him, he took off. Confused, the man figured there must be something wrong with him, and then decides to call his house, hoping that someone there could come and pick him up. So he finds a payphone and calls for his wife, but an unfamiliar voice greets him. When he asks if his wife was there, he's told that she was at a funeral because her husband was killed in an accident downtown the previous day. This one stuck with me because of that feeling of, what do people know that I don't? And I can't lie, I've always been fond of the concept of people that aren't aware they've died and are just carrying on like normal. The story doesn't overstay its welcome, which I think is crucial when telling a short horror story. It's not perfect by any means, but it could be much worse. In second place for this collection is Somebody Fell from Aloft. This story reads like a diary entry, which is already a refreshing departure from the structure of most of these stories. It follows a crew member of a merchant ship that's bound for England. One night, the ship is sailing through a dense fog when somebody comes falling down onto the deck from high above. It lands in front of a guy named McLaren who lets out a shriek and faints. The crew gathers around to see who it was that fell, but it doesn't appear to be anyone among their ranks. Eventually, after McLaren wakes up, the captain gives the order to toss the body overboard. But the crew didn't want to touch him, so McLaren decides that he'll toss the body, mentioning he's handled him once and will handle him again. But when he goes to get rid of the body, it wraps its arms around him and they both go tumbling overboard together. After making it back home, the narrator discovers that McLaren had murdered a crewmate from a previous ship in the same fashion that the mysterious body had come crashing to the deck. I enjoy this story because of the style it's written in, from the perspective of a bystander who's just witnessed the impossible. I also enjoy that despite its length, it does feel like a fully realized story while leaving just enough for your imagination to latch onto. It's a simple ghost gets revenge plot, but for what it was, I think it worked. In first place for book 2 is The Curse. In this tale, a man named Charlie is telling the narrator about the time his college fraternity was permanently disbanded. There were 9 members in total and they intended to take in 2 more. So Charlie's fraternity took these 2 initiates out to an abandoned house where 2 guys around their age had recently been murdered, and to make matters more absurd, the murderer was still at large. After both boys are sent into the house and neither of them come back out, the fraternity and later authorities launch an extensive search but never find the missing initiates. Charlie goes on to explain that after they graduated, someone must have placed a curse on them. Every year since graduation, around the same time of year as the initiation, one of the 9 men had either died or gone crazy, and at this point, Charlie was the only one left. The ending is kind of phoned in with the same parenthesized stage instructions telling you to spook your closest friend, but everything before this was really engaging to me. There aren't any tangible answers, 2 people go missing, and then the survivors are stricken with a curse despite not necessarily meaning to put their peers in harm's way. The story's just long enough that it doesn't feel rushed, nor does it overstay its welcome, and the recounting of information like a memory does keep it fresh. It's far and away the best story in this book that feels the most complete. Our third place in this set is The Appointment. In this story, a 16-year-old while out and about runs into Death, who beckons to him. Justifiably terrified, the young man tells his grandfather what happened and then takes his grandfather's truck and goes to the city, hoping to hide. Soon after, the boy's grandfather goes looking for Death and asks why he frightened his grandson, to which Death apologized, saying he was just surprised to see him in town that day because he had an appointment with the boy later on, in the city. This story is extremely short, but pretty easily gets across the idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy, as well as the futility of running from death. It's easy to see the ending coming if you're above the middle school age bracket, but the conciseness and the fact that death is aimed at a child, something we very rarely see in modern pop culture, was refreshingly dark. The second place story in this set is The Dream. In this story, we follow a young artist who is wrapping up her time painting in a small country town. She planned to head to another town the next day, but ultimately chose not to after having a dream where she walked up a dark staircase leading to a room with a carpet made up of large squares and windows nailed shut. A pale woman with black hair and eyes came into the room and warned her that the place she found herself in was evil and to flee while she still could. The next morning, she goes to a different town and is directed to a room she can rent in a house on a hill. The landlady appears motherly and all seems well until the artist finds herself walking up the stairs from her dream and into a room identical to the one she had dreamt about. Before long, the same pale-faced woman enters the room and the young artist flees immediately. For me, this one is nowhere close to scary on the surface, but the implications of what that room could have meant or the fate it could have led to is what make it fascinating. It makes you wonder what kind of evil resided there, how long the pale woman had been stuck there, and so on. It raises a lot of fun questions that add to the unsettling nature of what is otherwise just an okay story, and to be honest, what we aren't told is what makes this story stick with me. Finally, the best story in this set, and probably my favorite in the trilogy, is Harold. In this story, two cowherders were spending 2 months in a valley. They did the same thing day in and day out, and eventually their boredom led to an idea. They made a life-size doll to use as a scarecrow, and they made it to look like Harold, a man they both hated. They did their best to make it look like Harold too, and after he was built, they'd make fun of him, smear food on his face, and even take their anger out on him. Until one night Harold grunted, startling them both. Then came the realization that Harold was somehow getting larger. One morning, Harold got up of his own will and started walking around, and the men decided they'd leave the valley that same day and leave Harold behind. On their way out of the valley, they realized they'd left something important behind that would be expensive to replace, so they drew straws to see who would go back since both were terrified of Harold. When the man that had continued home came to a rise in the valley, he looked back to try and spot his friend that went back for the equipment they'd left, but he didn't see him anywhere. However, he did see Harold, who was on the roof of their hut stretching out a bloody skin to dry in the sun. The artwork for the story alone is already memorable, but the story itself is also well structured and doesn't overstay its welcome while still feeling the most complete of everything we've read so far. I enjoy the transition of two guys just building a scarecrow to cure their boredom with, turning into them being frightened by it slowly developing a will of its own. The final sentence also makes you wonder what went down when the man went back. At the very least, we know that man is dead and has been skinned, which is already pretty wild. With that out of the way, I'm sure those of you who are familiar with these stories are curious what I think about some of the other ones that I didn't mention, especially if your favorite is among those that I didn't talk about. Here's how everything stacks up against the 9 stories I went over. As you can see, I think most of the stories are either just okay or downright bad. There are a few reasons for this. One, because a lot of these stories are based on urban legends, we've heard them tons of times, so the moment the core premise is introduced, you can guess the ending right away, which isn't the author's fault or even the fault of the stories themselves. That's just more a victim of the passage of time and the continual circulation of the same stories. 2, most of these stories have really interesting setups but are too short to really expand upon them. Quite a few stories just abruptly end, leaving you feeling like there should have definitely been more there. And 3, many of the stories, if they aren't marred by their length, are just plain boring. I can always tell when something isn't grabbing my attention because my eyes skip around the page, and that happened a lot during plenty of the tales. After I got done reading these stories again, I realized that the ones that had stuck with me after all this time were the ones that I'd also found interesting as a kid. I'd completely forgotten most of them, and for a good reason. Though, in this collection's defense, I do have to admit that I am coming from this from the perspective of an adult that's consumed a ton of horror media in some form or fashion. I think any middle schooler could still get plenty of mileage out of this collection of books, as it kind of gently nudges them towards being interested in spooky stuff without completely scarring them for life. I'm sure that leaves a few of you to ask what I think about the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark movie that came out a while back. Surprisingly, I thought it was actually pretty enjoyable, all things considered. It could have easily ended up being a total cornfest, but given the handful of stories it chose to adapt, I thought it worked pretty well for what it was. If the books can be summarized as baby's first horror story, the movie could easily be summarized as baby's first horror film. The film follows Stella and her friends August, Chuck, and Ramon. Each of them appear to be outcasts in their own ways, with Stella getting picked on because her mom abandoned their family, and Ramon getting ostracized for, not being white. After some shenanigans that involve a flaming bag of poop, Stella and her friends decided it would be cool to break into the condemned home of the Bellows, one of the first families to settle in their town. According to Stella, a woman named Sarah was being imprisoned there by her own family, and to pass the days, she'd tell scary stories through the wall to children that would come to the exterior of the house. When children started to disappear or die, Sarah was the one blamed, but before the town's angry mob could get their hands on her, she'd elected to quit back out to the pre-game lobby by hanging herself. Soon after this information is given to us, Stella discovers Sarah's old book of scary stories and asks the spirit of the woman to tell her a story in the way children used to. This basically reawakens Sarah's spirit, and then Stella makes the fun mistake of taking the book of stories home with her. There's a pretty neat moment where Stella's flipping through the book and we see familiar titles from the Scary Stories collection, but then she notices a new story has appeared. Harold. The story details the demise of a guy named Tommy who was known to bully Stella and her friends. With Harold being one of my favorite stories, I was definitely curious to see how this would turn out, but I was also surprised to see it playing out so early in the film. However, I was pleasantly surprised by how the tension is built in the scene as well as the level of violence and body horror. It's nothing insane, but considering this was kind of sold as a family horror movie, I was content with the route the creators took. Naturally, Stella's pretty freaked out by the sudden appearance of the story as well as Tommy's disappearance. She's even further stressed when she goes to see the scarecrow described in the story and it's wearing Tommy's Letterman jacket. So she does what anyone would do and decides to put the stolen murder book back where she got it. However, Ramon stops by and Stella notices he's reading Sarah's book. When questioned on the matter, he says it was on her bookshelf, which doesn't sit well with Stella. She opens the book as another story is written right before their very eyes, but this time the story is about August with the core built on top of the story, the big toe. Stella goes to warn August, but he doesn't take the matter too seriously until he discovers a big toe in the stew he's eating, a stew that seemed to have mysteriously appeared in his fridge. By the time he's taking the threat seriously, it's already too late for him to make a clean getaway, and he's ultimately taken by the story's monster. The Big Toe isn't a very good story in my opinion, but the movie does a solid job of making it feel more spooky than it does on paper. After August disappears, the grim reality of the book's power settles in as everyone realizes that a story could be written about them at any point, and its appearance is basically a death sentence if even a single false move or poor decision is made. The group decides the best way to stop what's happening is to learn more about Sarah Bellows herself. The research is interrupted by the appearance of another iconic story, The Red Spot, this time about Chuck's sister Ruth. I love and hate this segment because I am horribly arachnophobic, but the creeping sense of dread coupled with how gross the growing boil on her cheek gets really makes this work. Not to mention the sheer number of spiders that come crawling out of her face when the boil finally pops was more than enough to make my stomach churn. So A+ on that movie. The incident causes Ruth to have a mental break and she's carted off to the nut house. After that, Chuck tells Stella and Ramon about a recurring nightmare he's been having about a red room where a pale woman with black eyes comes in and warns him to flee while he can. I thought this was a clever way to implement the story The Dream with the same kind of foreshadowing that set it up in the book series. Chuck expresses a justifiable fear of this nightmare being brought to life by the power of the book. After getting some more clues, the gang ends up at a mental health facility to attempt to dig up records about Sarah. Turns out the records are stored in something called the Red Room, which, naturally, Chuck wants no part of. The group breaks into a restricted section, and when Chuck again shows reluctance to go to the Red Room, Stella and Ramon leave him behind instead of one of them staying behind to keep an eye on Chuck. While he's on his own, Chuck alerts some staff who realize he's not supposed to be in the area he's in, and a chase ensues. This chase causes alarms to go off, casting the hallway Chuck's in a red light, effectively turning it into a red room. He's set upon by the pale woman from his dream and absorbed into her. Stella and Ramon get there too late and are taken to the police station for questioning. While incarcerated, another story unfolds with Ramon in the crosshairs. The story is Mitai Dodi Walker, which is a story I honestly think is immeasurably stupid, and even within the context of the film, it doesn't work very well. I feel like The Thing or even The Wendigo would have made for better choices here. And while I'm at it, I think Room for One More would have been a more fitting story to take out August, since it's something that would suit a more upright and polite character like him, as well as could have stretched out over the entire film until he ultimately gave in during a panic trying to escape a different horror. Anywho, the creature from Ramon's story puts itself back together, kills the police chief, and then pursues Ramon. He splits up from Stella to lure the creature away and give her a chance to finally end things. Going back to the Bellows estate, some weird timey-wimey stuff goes down and Stella ends up occupying Sarah's body in the past, where she witnesses firsthand how poorly the Bellows treated her. Eventually though, after chastising Sarah's ghost and promising to tell the world the truth about Sarah's family and her innocence when it came to the missing/murdered children, the ghost gives Stella an out. With that, everything is a-okay again, except Tommy, August, and Chuck don't come back. Ramon survived his story and Ruth's brain is no longer broken, so it's just a happy ending all around. So yeah, I think all in all, the movie worked well enough for what it set out to be. It wasn't trying to be the darkest, grittiest horror movie on the block. It was just trying to be a fun, sometimes spoopy nostalgia trip for people like me who grew up reading these stories. I left out a ton of information for brevity's sake, but I do recommend you check out this movie if you have nothing else to watch for Halloween this year. The acting can be kind of cringe every now and then, particularly when the characters are trying too hard to emote properly, and the dialogue can be just as jank. It doesn't completely ruin the experience, but it does kind of remind you that this is kind of like a horror for dummies kind of ride. Scary stories to tell in the dark was a big part of my childhood, in the same vein as Resident Evil. Without these stories, I don't think I would have ever discovered or jumped into the world of creepypasta. I'm glad I took the time to revisit these stories, even if they didn't quite hit the way I remember. But that's just part of growing up, right? Conquering and moving past our childhood fears without even realizing it. Then it's on to brand new fears to keep us on our toes. Like capitalism. Anyway, that wraps things up for me here. I'm not sure if I'll put anything out for Halloween, but we'll see. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe. And while you're at it, why don't you tell me about some of your childhood fears in the comments below? Another hearty thanks and shout out to my supporters over on Patreon. If you're feeling so inclined and want to see videos early, consider following the link in the description below. Come join us on Discord where you can keep up to date on what content is coming and what's going on with the channel, and come hang out on Twitch where I stream Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Links to both will also be below. Remember to take care of yourselves and others. I hope your days remain or become Saturnian, and as always, thanks for watching.